We talked yesterday about this report into housing affordability. Sydney's now the third least affordable housing market in the world. Anyone listening to us across Sydney today would know that. Melbourne's sixth. I was staggered to find out that Adelaide and Brisbane make the top 20 most unaffordable places in the world to buy a house. An inquiry's been done into home ownership, headed by the federal Liberal MP, Jason Falinski, of course, member on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. He's on the line. Good to talk to you again.
Hey, Steve. How are you?
Good. Didn't come as a surprise to anyone in Sydney, but I think Adelaide and Brisbane might be a little surprised how expensive it is to buy property in their jurisdictions.
And Perth is the 23rd least affordable city in the world. So, I mean, of the 5 capital cities in Australia, they're all in the 25 least affordable housing markets in the world.
Canberra's not too cheap either.
And Canberra's moving up. Yep.
Why?
We could very soon. Well, because of government regulatory failure. I mean, when you look at it quite simply, we have enough land in Australia to build on. Average weekly earnings are some of the highest in the world. Our minimum wage is 50% higher than anywhere else in the world. And the high priest of planning policy basically restricts supply of housing. So over the long term, you see house prices go higher and higher. And what's incentivising this? Well, the higher a house price is, the more money state and territory governments get from stamp duty, and the more money local governments get from developer charges and rates.
So the idea of stamp duty, there was a push within the New South Wales Liberal National Coalition government to drop stamp duty. Where did that end up going?
So that's at the moment they're working through that, but once again the Labor Party's come out against it because there's political advantage in them doing that. But if the New South Wales government can pull it off, either now or in the next 3 to 4 years, the result is that over time, you see all that incentive for restricting supply, for making it difficult for young Australians to buy their home, go out of the market. There's not money in it anymore. And so suddenly you'll find state governments providing zoned land, planning reform, and improvements to allowing people to build houses where people want to live and in the type of house they want to live in.
I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia, and my dad in 1959 bought a house 10 or 15 kilometres south of Adelaide, which at that time was the outskirts. And at the top of the end of our street, Jason, there was paddocks where there was still sheep grazing. Now, that's all now covered with houses. But the South Australian government, way back then, they were actually financing the construction of houses and selling them to people cheaply.
Yeah, well, they're doing the opposite now. So when you buy a home and land package, definitely in New South Wales and every other state is not that far behind here, 50% of the price you pay is state and local government taxes and charges. So you want to halve the price of home and land packages in most states and territories. Simply get them to stop charging taxes on new land and home, and you immediately reduce the price by 50%.
Or step in and don't allow property speculators to do the building and get the government to do it.
Well, see, that's one of the mythologies in the market, because what you have is, so over the last 2 years, there's been no investor activity in Australia. And what happened was prices went up 20%. And this is actually a good analysis or a good perspective on it, which is everywhere in the world, interest rates dropped to close to zero. In some places, they went below zero. So you saw an increase in house prices. In Australia, they moved up by more than 20%. In places like Texas, where they have flexible planning laws and supply markets, their house prices went up, but by 0.8% and 0.6%. That's the difference that planning makes to the price of a house and a dwelling. And Steve, your point is exactly right. If you don't have a home, people delay having families. It creates wealth inequality across the country. It has an impact on even the stability of your democracy, because the more people who don't own homes, the more people who feel they don't have a part in the Australian story. And that's what we need to reverse.
Your report didn't go down all that well with your colleague Rob Stokes in New South Wales, the planning minister. He said, rather than repetitive inquiries, I encourage the Commonwealth Government to take concrete policy action that will actually do something to address supply and affordability. I don't quite get what Mr. Stokes is getting at. What can the federal government do about addressing supply? You can't do anything, can you?
Well, our recommendations aren't finalised yet, but the Commonwealth basically subsidises the state's housing programs to the tune of slightly over $30 billion a year. And I think what we should start doing is attaching conditions to that, which is around planning reform, around housing targets. So in New South Wales or Metro Sydney, there are 35 councils. Only one of those 35 councils is meeting their housing targets. And the housing targets they've been given is to have even more undersupply of housing in Sydney. So at the moment, according to the New South Wales Government's Productivity Commission, Sydney has an undersupply of 100,000 homes. Their housing targets will see by the end of this decade that move to 150,000 homes, and only one of the 35 councils is meeting those housing targets. That's why we have an affordability crisis. That's why young Australians can't buy a home in Australia.
It's such a fascinating topic, and we could go on forever about it. But I mean, the argument about if state governments, with federal help, had built fast rail north and south of Sydney, west of Sydney, and in Melbourne exactly the same, north mainly, you could have people living in areas like the Central Coast. You can go on the south coast of New South Wales. You could go to outside Bendigo, Ballarat and Victoria, and you could then have bigger land releases, and people could then buy a property at a reasonable amount but still get to work. All of that now has been thrown in the air with this at-home working issue. So this drives the economy, Jason. It's such an important issue.
Steve, I couldn't have said it better myself. In the 40s, 50s and 60s, when we got home ownership up to roughly the mid 80% mark, how that was done was essentially the Menzies government subsidised infrastructure rollout. So roads, water, electricity, not sewerage, I know, but those big three, which allow people to then go and buy land and build homes on them. Infrastructure that you just talked about is that of the 21st century. So if you have very fast rail, you immediately open up large swathes of well-located land. And the Governor of the Reserve Bank makes that point ad nauseum, that if you wanted to actually fix this problem in the long term, you need to invest in transport infrastructure to open supply of land.
Yeah, fast train from Goulburn to Sydney, work there, simple, and the way working practices now are, you could probably make an arrangement with your boss. I'll work 3 days in the city and the other 2, Monday, Friday, I'll work from home.
Yep, exactly. And that's what a lot of people are now doing. So that's, and that will be one of the answers. But ultimately, I have to say also that the biggest problem here is, as I said, the high priest of planning policy. The whole idea that someone can sit in Macquarie Street or Canberra and essentially tell you what house is going where and what it looks like, regardless of what the average Australian wants to buy or wants to live in there, that has been a big driver of this problem.
What do you say to a 23, 24-year-old? I've got one of each, so that's why I ask, who say, well, we're never going to be able to afford to buy a house.
Well, that's not true. That's not true. And don't think that. I mean, I know it seems that way at the moment. And to them, I would also say one of the recommendations of the report will be along the lines of helping people like your sons not have to save the full amount of the deposit to buy their first home, because that's the biggest barrier at the moment for people getting into the housing market. So that's one place where the Commonwealth can make a massive difference. But we can also make a massive difference by actually calling the state and local governments to account, to start building homes for people to live in, and to start letting people to build the homes they want to live in, because that's going to make the big difference in both the medium and long term.
Great to catch up again, Jason. Thanks a lot, mate.
Steve, really appreciate it. Thanks.
Jason Falinski, Liberal MP for the seat of Mackellar. He's been the chair of that parliamentary committee, and all of those arguments are valid. They need to keep being had, because so many of our young folk just look at it and say, well, I'm going to be renting for the rest of my life.